In Dublin in 2005, two sisters, Linda and Charlotte Mulhall, went out with their mother, Kathleen, and her partner, Farah Swali Noor.
It was St. Patrick's weekend. Linda, Charlotte, Kathleen and Farah were all out drinking in Dublin city centre.
During a disagreement that escalated, the Mulhall sisters brutally killed Farah.
This is a scene of frenzied violence involving two women who were very high and intoxicated on drugs with alcohol. It was a really violent and manic attack.
Charlotte and Linda then dismembered Farah before discarding his body parts like rubbish.
The violence meted out on Farah was way, way more than was necessary to kill him. This is what we call overkill. It's gratuitous.
The press dubbed the siblings the Scissor Sisters.
It was directly as a result of the way that the body was mutilated and cut up into pieces.
This is the most violent attack you can imagine.
The Mulhall sisters had cemented their place in history as two of the world's most evil killers. In Dublin in March 2005, a passerby noticed something unusual floating in the Royal Canal.
Didn't know quite what it was, and when it was retrieved, it was found to be a leg and the sock was still on it.
As the canal was being searched by specialist teams, more body parts were discovered. The man was identified as 40-year-old Kenyan national Farah Swali Noor, and the last known sighting of him was with his partner Kathleen and her daughters Charlotte and Linda Mulhall.
Kathleen and Farah went out drinking with Charlotte and Linda, and it was reported that, they couldn't even get in any of the pubs because of their behaviour.
The four went back to Kathleen and Farah's flat, where an argument broke out. Farah was knocked out after falling back and hitting his head against a bed frame.
We've now got Noor on the floor, unconscious. Linda is hitting his head with a hammer, and Charlotte is stabbing him in the torso. It's an absolutely frenzied attack of the worst kind of violence.
What the sisters did next would go on to shock the world. These killer stories begin about 10 kilometres southeast of Dublin city centre. Linda Mulhall was born in 1975 and Charlotte was born in 1984.
Mulhall sisters lived in Tala, County Dublin.
There's a lot of poverty in Tala, particularly in the area that they come from.
They were a socially disadvantaged family. They had a lot of problems growing up. They were early school leavers. They'd also used drugs as teenagers and it took the wrong path in life.
Their parents, Kathleen and John Mulhall, didn't have a particularly stable marriage.
John is reported to have been an incredibly violent person, and I think they certainly witnessed violence against their mother routinely.
I think Kathleen had a very checkered history herself with alcohol and drugs. This was not any kind of conventional upbringing.
As a teenager, Linda Mulhall followed a similar path.
Linda was known to take drugs, misuse alcohol.
At every turn, she had made wrong decisions in both her personal life and her education. And she had, I suppose, entered her 20s as someone who was a very vulnerable person, very disadvantaged person.
In 1993, around the age of 18, Linda Mulhall began a relationship and went on to start a family. But it didn't work out, as planned.
Linda had been married and she had 4 children, and that relationship ended, and she became involved in a new relationship.
Linda began a romance with Wayne Kinsella, a man with a history of criminal behavior and who had previously served time in prison for manslaughter.
He beat Linda and her children. Eventually, he got 7 years for child cruelty.
Despite her personal struggles, at times Linda Mulhall also found herself on the wrong side of the law.
Linda has 1 prior conviction for larceny in 1993. She seemed to be someone who largely stayed away from the criminal courts. Charlotte, on the other hand, had a number of minor convictions in her past, from prostitution to criminal damage to public order offences.
9 years younger than Linda, Charlotte had a reputation as being a stern and dangerous character.
But that doesn't fit with what she actually was. I think that in some ways was a mask that she used to conceal her own vulnerability. She was someone who had really no breaks in life.
Their mother, Kathleen, is by no means stable either. She's been beaten by her husband. She's seen her children abused. She's taken refuge in alcohol and drugs. This is a horror show when it comes to a family.
In 2002, Kathleen Mulhall met a man called Farah Swali Noor. He'd moved to Ireland from Africa, but his origins weren't as he'd suggested.
Farah Swali Noor was a Kenyan, a man who was born in 1965, and he came to this country under the guise of being a Somalian refugee. He had a story that his family had been murdered.
When the truth emerged, Farah evaded deportation when it became known he'd fathered a child in Ireland and therefore had a right to stay.
During the time he was in Ireland, between 1996 and 1999, he raped a disabled 16-year-old girl who went on to have a child. He had a relationship with a young woman in Cork who was only 16. He pretended to be 20, when of course he was a great deal older than 20. She too had a child. She too was abused by Farah Noor. This is a man with a very nasty streak indeed. Someone whom you would treat with great caution.
Kathleen Mulhall was still living with her husband when Farah became part of her life.
Farah Noor met Kathleen while she was still married to John Mulhall. They continued to have an affair together, and eventually Kathleen left John to start a relationship.
She probably was delighted that this guy had some sort of interest in her. I think he possibly had other reasons to be involved with her, but they entered into a relationship. He, at one stage, moved into the Mulhall home, forcing John Mulhall to move out for a period of time. But eventually, John Mulhall returned to the family home, and Kathleen left her children to move to Cork with Farah Swali Noor.
Sadly for Kathleen, the move with her new lover wasn't the beautiful romance she was probably hoping for after her turbulent marriage.
When they were in Cork, it was clear to neighbours and all around them that he was very abusive towards Kathleen. It actually led to a number of hospitalisations. She had gone to hospital with blurred vision, injuries to her wrist and her hands, and she had fractured ribs.
Less than 2 years after they started their relationship, Kathleen Mulhall and Farah Swali Noor moved back to Dublin.
In September 2004, Farah and Kathleen moved back to Dublin, and they seek help from the asylum seekers unit to get rehoused, and she finds a small flat.
The flat they were given was in Dublin city centre and meant that Kathleen was once again living close to her daughters, 30-year-old Linda and 21-year-old Charlotte, on a street adjacent to Dublin's Royal Canal. On the 30th of March 2005, a passerby on the canal footpath noticed something unusual. in the water.
A member of the public noticed something floating in the Royal Canal and didn't know quite what it was.
The object in the water looked similar to a human leg, with the sock still on the foot. But this was a busy city centre area, so the chances of a dismembered body being deposited there seemed highly unlikely. The passerby assumed there was an innocent explanation.
They thought it was a mannequin that someone had dumped in the canal out on their walks, and then we're kind of looking at this, kind of wondering, could it be a body? And most people, when they see something like that, they tend not to act on it because they don't believe what they're seeing themselves.
The emergency services were called to investigate further, and the object was retrieved from the canal. It didn't take long to confirm that it was, in fact, a human leg.
Gardaí are noticed that there has been a foul deed committed, because here we have a leg, and that's only the start of it.
As investigators searched the water, they found more body parts from what appeared to be from the same person. A male human torso was discovered, but the head had been removed from the body.
Effectively, what they had was a series of body parts without a head, and that gave rise to lots of different suspicions and theories as to what had happened to this man.
The body had been in the water for some time, causing pigmentation to be lost from the skin.
So a difficulty the Gardaí had was they couldn't even establish his ethnicity. There was no head, there was no way to identify the body parts. This would have been quite a difficult case for the Gardaí to investigate.
A murder investigation immediately commenced because this wasn't an accident. Someone had tried to conceal a crime, and it was quite clear to police arriving at the scene that the victim had been stabbed to death because his torso was quite heavily damaged and he'd been stabbed 27 times.
The level of decomposition suggested that the person had died approximately 1 week earlier, which would have been around St. Patrick's Day weekend. Officers knew that a brutal murder had taken place, but before they could start to look for the killer, they would have to establish who the victim was. One of the only clues was what was found on the torso, a soccer jersey.
This torso still had the T-shirt on it. You could take a photograph of this T-shirt and circulate the photographs to see, does anybody know anybody who's wearing a T-shirt like this and they are missing, you haven't seen them?
It was a long shot, but it was all the police had to go on at that stage. They had to hope against all odds that somebody would come forward with information.
And they appealed for anyone who had information or had encountered anyone who had been wearing this piece of clothing around St. Patrick's Day to come forward.
Detectives investigating the case would have known that the chances of any information coming off the back of this appeal would be slim. But on the 9th of May, there was a breakthrough.
A friend of Farah Noor, who hasn't seen him, recognises a T-shirt that Noor was wearing the last time he saw him. And the same T-shirt is on the torso of the mutilated body that's discovered.
The body was confirmed as being that of Farah Swali Noor. Farah had been stabbed multiple times and then dismembered before his body parts were disposed of. Officers now knew the identity of the victim, but now had to find out who was responsible for such a horrific and brutal murder. The friend who'd identified Farah's T-shirt had also told officers who Farah had been with when he last saw him wearing it. His partner, Kathleen Mulhall, and her 2 daughters, Charlotte and Linda.
20th of March 2005, it was St. Patrick's weekend. Linda, Charlotte, Kathleen and Farah were all out drinking in Dublin city centre. Linda, Kathleen and Charlotte had ecstasy, whereas Farah remained only drinking.
Kathleen Mulhall had decided to put some crushed ecstasy into Farah Swallow-Noor's drink. So you had this bizarre situation where you had a mother, her two daughters, and the mother's young lover from Africa walking around Dublin, drinking and having consumed some ecstasy and trying to work out what they were going to do for the rest of the day.
This isn't an ordinary group. This is a group of people, heavy drinkers, heavy drug users, and it was reported that he couldn't even get in any of the pubs because of their behaviour.
The flat shared by Kathleen and Farah was within walking distance of the city centre, and unable to get into any bars, they decided to take the party back home instead, arriving back at the flat around 6:30 p.m.
It was quite a small cottage. It had one small couch that could only comfortably sit two people. So Linda was sitting down with Charlotte on her lap, Farah was sitting next to her, and Kathleen was on the arm of the chair. Farah kept arguing with Kathleen and was quite agitated at that time.
Linda and Charlotte had noticed that Farah was looking at Linda in a kind of sexual way and started to make advances to her. He had started putting his arms around her, started touching her inappropriately.
So Kathleen and Charlotte, in fact, both got very, very angry with Farah. She was resisting and telling him to get off and leave her alone.
At that point, Charlotte jumped up and she stated, "Let go of my sister," because Linda was trying to physically get away from him.
Farah's unwanted sexual advances towards his partner's daughter had caused tensions to rise dramatically within the group. But rather than call for help, Charlotte and Linda Mulhall decided to take the law into their own hands.
Charlotte, the youngest, picks up a Stanley knife from the kitchen and threatens Noor. He doesn't care, and she stabs him in the neck with the Stanley knife. She cuts an artery in his neck.
Farah stumbles then back into one of the bedrooms. He hits his head against one of the beds. He's knocked unconscious.
The sisters could have stopped there. But instead, they continued their brutal assault on the incapacitated man.
Linda picks up a hammer, hitting Farah in his head with such ferocity and strength that actually it left dent marks in the carpets. Charlotte then receives a bread knife and she goes into the room and starts stabbing his back and his torso.
She punctures his lungs. She perforates his liver. This is the most violent attack you can imagine.
This is a scene of frenzied violence involving two women who were very high and intoxicated on drugs with alcohol. And within the space of minutes, he had been stabbed 27 times and he had suffered various types of injuries to his head. Their mum had not participated in it, but certainly watched and screamed, but not tried to stop it from happening. And within the space of a few minutes, they were suddenly found themselves confronted by a man who was dead, and they didn't know what to do.
A day that had started out in fun and celebration had taken a dark turn. 40-year-old Farah Swallow-Noor had been savagely killed in his own home by his partner's daughters.
The violence meted out on Farah was way, way more than was necessary to kill him. I mean, this is what we call overkill. It's gratuitous. There's not many times that you will see that level of rage coming from a woman. The fact that it was two women, the fact that it was rage-filled and so violent makes this highly unusual.
Here they were, the three of them, standing over a body and planning what they were going to do next.
Linda and Charlotte Mulhall had brutally killed Farah Swali Noor, stabbing him 27 times and bludgeoning his skull with a hammer. This was already a sickening act of violence, but the sisters were about to take their behaviour to an even more disturbing level.
Farah Noor is dead. The three women are confronted by what to do. They know full well that they've killed him, and they've killed him deliberately.
Farah had been unconscious, yet the Mulhall sisters had continued with their fatal attack rather than call the authorities.
I think they may have been in a better position had they called the police and told the Gardaí that essentially this man was attempting to sexually assault my sister, but I think it was the action and the quick response that they had afterwards, which was to get rid of the body.
The scene could almost be described as being akin to a slaughterhouse. There was blood on the floors, on the walls. There was parts of their victims' flesh all over their hands.
In a shocking move, the women dragged Farah's lifeless body into the bathroom of the flat.
It's at this time that Linda and Charlotte decide to dismember Farah Noor. To do this, Charlotte used a knife to try and dismember his legs and his arms. Linda used the hammer to try and dislocate his joints to make it easier.
Finally, separate Noor into 8 parts. But even more horrifying, Linda decides that she's going to cut off Noor's penis. It does defy belief, actually, but nevertheless it's true. They take the head and put it in a suitcase.
The other body parts were put into separate bin bags, ready to be removed from the flat. It was around this time that the gravity of what the sisters had done started to kick in.
Linda and Charlotte decided then to call their father, John Mulhall, and tell them what happened.
He claims that he didn't believe it, but he went in, couldn't see Farah Swali Noor inside, and then realised that there was a bin liner that looked as if it had been stuffed with various body parts leaning against the wall in the bathroom.
John Mulhall hurried out of the flat and vomited before telling the women he didn't want to be involved in the situation. Charlotte and Linda Mulhall were left to deal with the consequences of their own actions.
They came up with this idea to actually dump various body parts in the Royal Canal, which was close to where Kathleen and Farah had lived.
Dublin's Royal Canal ran adjacent to the street where the murder had occurred.
They just literally bagged their victims' remains and made their way to a canal and dumped the body parts in the watercourse.
They placed the head in a suitcase out in the back garden. It wasn't until the next morning at 11 a.m. they decided to dispose of the head.
In a shocking act that showed a blatant disregard for what they'd done the night before, Linda, Charlotte and Kathleen left the flat at around 11:30 a.m. with Farah's head in a bag and walked to the nearby shops on Summer Hill Parade.
They went in for something to eat, some breakfast, I think, and just cold, hard, calculated. The fact that there was a head in the bag and they could just carry on as normal.
Linda and Charlotte eating together. They don't appear to be full of guilt. They don't even really appear to be worried with the evidence of murder that they have with them.
The sisters finished eating their breakfast, then boarded a bus to Talla, 12 kilometres away, still carrying Farah's head in a bag.
You can imagine there was quite a few passengers on the bus, and they sat down with the head in the bag, and nobody suspected a thing.
They just went about their business. It gave the impression that they were very casual killers, that they really had disassociated themselves mentally from the acts that they'd been involved in and didn't care too much about what they were doing at all.
The sisters got off the bus in Talla and headed to the Sean Walsh Memorial Park. It was here they decided to dispose of the head.
Charlotte digs a hole in the park, a secluded part, and buries the head in it. Kathleen then takes the hammer and the Stanley knife and throws them into a lake in the park.
After disposing of the body and burying Farah's head, Charlotte, Linda and Kathleen dedicated their attention to cleaning the crime scene, attempting to remove all traces of their heinous act.
It's impossible to clean a scene like that where you're dealing with liters of blood have been spilled across the walls and the floor. You can't really clean that without burning the building to the ground, but that wasn't something that they thought too much about.
The Mulhall sisters and their mum probably thought their efforts would leave them in the clear. They had disposed of the body, cleaned the crime scene, and the victim hadn't had many people around him.
Farah Noor was alone in Ireland. He didn't have any family in Ireland, huge amount of friends. So it wouldn't have been clear to them that he would have been missing for quite some time.
What the Mulhalls couldn't have expected when disposing of the body in the canal was that it would be found so soon. With Farah's body identified and the victim being linked to the Mulhalls, the family were brought in for questioning.
When Kathleen was questioned by the guards, she maintained that Farah was still alive.
Kathleen had been telling people around her that Farah had just disappeared or that he'd gone off with another woman. Officers knew they'd need more evidence to link the women to the death of Farah Swali Noor. As one of the last people to be seen with Farah, and having been the person he was living with, Kathleen was of high interest to the police. She'd now moved from the flat where the murder happened to another flat in the same building.
Kathleen Mulhall's decision to move from the location, in her mind, was a way of putting distance between her and the crime, but it actually assisted the investigation because they suddenly found themselves with a possible scene of crime that the prime suspect was no longer resident in. So it was much easier to get forensic teams into that location to start carrying out tests.
But any DNA found in the property would have to be analysed, a process that wouldn't provide any potential evidence for around 6 weeks. On the 11th of July, another offering of information was provided to detectives.
Gardaí received 2 separate phone calls. These phone calls wanted to remain anonymous. The Gardaí decided to meet with these 2 callers. It turns out that it was James and John Mulhall Jr., both who were remanded in custody in Wheatfield Prison.
James and John Mulhall Jr. were Charlotte and Linda's brothers. Kathleen had been to visit her sons in prison after Farah's body was found and confessed to them. Worried that their mother was going to be wrongfully accused of murder, the brothers decided to contact the police.
They confirmed that they believed that the body that was found was that of Farah Noor and that he was in a relationship with their mother.
One of them came forward and told the Gardaí that, in fact, it wasn't Kathleen, it was Linda and Charlotte.
The Mulhall brothers also implicated their father, John Mulhall, who their mother told them was at the flat that night. And by the 3rd of August, the police now had enough information to arrest Charlotte, Linda, Kathleen, and John for questioning.
Girls denied all knowledge of Farah's demise. They had no idea, they had no clues to offer. They were not able to help the Garda inquiries.
DNA from the flat had now confirmed that the blood was Farah's, but without further proof or confessions, they didn't have enough to charge any of the Mulhalls.
They had an idea that whatever crime had been committed, it was emanating from this group of people who were pretending not to know anything about this, but they were the last people to see him alive.
The pressure of the situation became too much for Linda, and on the 19th of August, she contacted the police and admitted her involvement.
Linda Mulhall made a pretty frank confession. I think she was a woman who was haunted by the events of that night and really wanted to get them off her chest. And she described in detail what had happened.
Linda's confession gave officers an opportunity to arrest Charlotte and attempt to get her account of that evening.
Charlotte told the Gardaí that her and Linda had gone out and were out till all hours of the morning. She said that when she returned, she had seen Farah's bloody body, and that essentially was implicating that Kathleen was involved with it. She said that Linda told Kathleen that they will take care of it, they would take the fall.
Charlotte claimed to police that herself and Linda had not been part of the killing, but that they had dismembered the body. The police had Linda's detailed confession, but now Charlotte was placing the blame back at her mother's door, in the flat where the murder had taken place.
And of course, all trails led to Kathleen Mulhall, who had lived there, and you had this DNA contaminated crime scene that she had left behind.
In a shocking twist in the case, Kathleen fled the country in September 2005, and the police were unable to locate her. Charlotte was insisting Kathleen was responsible for the murder, but Linda's confession to the police had provided contradictory evidence, and the Mulhall sisters were charged with Farah's murder.
Charlotte and Linda were arrested and they were retained in custody until their trial date.
After his daughters were charged with the murder, John Mulhall took his own life.
John hangs himself in Phoenix Park.
As the sisters awaited trial, press interest in the case grew, and Linda and Charlotte Mulhall were given the nickname the Scissor Sisters.
The name the Scissor Sisters was coined by the media, and it was directly as a result of the way that the body was mutilated and cut up into pieces.
The trial of Charlotte and Linda Mulhall began on the 9th of October 2006 at Dublin's Central Criminal Court.
You have two sisters who are about to stand trial for the murder of Farah Noor. They both plead not guilty, even though Linda has confessed to the police.
The jury were presented with a tough decision to make about the case.
It was a very unique case. You had a victim who had predated on women for his entire adult life, and then you had two women that killed this guy in a moment of madness while drunk and on drugs. And I think that caused a lot of difficulties for the jury because it wasn't really a black and white case.
Charlotte and Linda had been charged with murder, but at trial the defense team asked that Linda be tried for manslaughter, due to her actions being a reaction to Farah's behaviour.
They were basing their defence on the fact that Farah was trying to make sexual advances towards her, very much unwanted sexual advances towards Linda, so they used the defence of provocation.
In an attempt to save their mother, Kathleen, from being blamed, two of her sons had contacted the police with information about the night in question, implicating their sisters, Charlotte and Linda, for the murder. One of the girls' sisters had also provided the police with a revelation.
One of their sisters tells the police that Charlotte, when drunk one night, has confessed to the killing too.
The prosecution also had Linda's original confession.
They had made statements incriminating themselves. They had family members willing to come in and give evidence in very difficult circumstances for those people and give evidence against their loved ones in their own family.
The pathologist would have come into court and would have given the jury insight into all of the injuries that he received. I think there was some suggestion that there was no defensive wounds, that this was a surprise attack to Farah.
Evidence against the Mulhall sisters was stacking up against them.
They would have had statements in relation to everyone who identified Farah from his body. So his friend who had noticed his jersey that he was wearing that day, and that the last time he saw him, he was with the Mulhall sisters. They received multiple samples of DNA throughout the cottage of his blood. So all of this would have been presented to the jury.
Author and journalist John Mooney was at the trial and remembers how it unfolded.
You could see as the days went by, the reality of what their circumstances began to sink in, that they knew they were going to be found guilty and they knew they were going to end up in prison.
After a 10-day trial, the jury went out to deliberate. They considered the evidence they'd been presented with for 18 hours over the course of 4 days. And in October 2006, they came back with their verdicts.
All of the evidence was presented at the Central Criminal Court in front of a jury of 12, and that jury came back and convicted Charlotte of murder.
Charlotte's sister, Linda, was convicted of manslaughter.
The jury did accept that in terms of Linda, she was provoked.
I remember looking at Linda Mulhall when she was found guilty and when the sentence was imposed. And she looked calm, but internally she looked distraught. And when you certainly looked in her eyes, she just saw her world ending.
On the 4th of December 2006, both sisters were sentenced. Linda received 15 years. Charlotte was given the mandatory life sentence for murder.
Judge Carney is a very eminent judge, and he described this murder as the most grotesque murder that he had seen down through the years in his professional service.
Linda and Charlotte were sent to Mountjoy Women's Prison to serve out their sentences. But their mother, Kathleen, was still nowhere to be found.
Kathleen Mulhall's decision to abandon her daughters and leave the state when they had been identified as their killers was really predictable in many ways. That particular woman had really been an uncaring mother throughout her entire life. She really thought about herself.
Kathleen had fled to England and been evading the authorities since her daughters were charged in December 2005. There was a chance she may never face justice for her own part in the murder. But the 53-year-old shocked everyone when she returned to Ireland voluntarily in February 2008, 4 years after Farah had been killed.
And in 2009, she too stands trial for aiding and abetting Linda and Charlotte.
Kathleen claimed she'd never witnessed the murder, but admitted that she had helped clean up the crime scene and conceal evidence.
She was charged with withholding evidence, with fleeing the country, and with giving false or misleading evidence, and also with helping the girls to clean up the scene of the murder. She got 5 years on her conviction.
Kathleen was also taken to Mountjoy Prison, where her daughters had been sent. But by that point, Charlotte was no longer a prisoner there.
Charlotte hasn't been a model prisoner.
Photographs were leaked to the press showing Charlotte Mulhall jokingly holding a knife to a male inmate's neck. She was transferred to Limerick Prison, and security across Irish prisons was ramped up as a result.
These two sisters are, in many ways, a tabloid sensation.
In 2018, after serving 12 years of her 15-year sentence, Linda was released from prison. Kathleen had also served her time and was out.
The only person still in jail for this ghastly killing is Charlotte, and she too is now being prepared for release.
In 2022, Charlotte began supervised day-released visits to her family in Dublin. And this is the first indicator of steps that she will be released, and it's to reintegrate her into society.
There was no doubt that Farah Swali Noor was a dubious and criminal individual, but legal recourses are available to punish and provide justice for crimes committed. Charlotte and Linda took the law into their own hands with their vigilante act of savagery.
There are ways of dealing with people, and while he may have provoked Linda, she certainly could have gone to the guards and made a complaint, and he would have more than likely been incarcerated for a number of years. But to die in the manner that he did and to be dismembered the way he was, no human being deserves that.
I think the issue in this case with regards of how they dealt with Farah's advances was that they took it to an extreme level. It's not that people can't defend themselves against sexual assaults, it's just how you do it and the gravity of how you do it.
This is a particularly gruesome and shocking crime, and certainly everybody was aware of it. It was the talk of the country that this person, should be murdered, stabbed, dismembered, and then the body parts gotten rid of. And then when you look at it in the cold light of day, where they're on the bus with the head, they're having breakfast, it's still hard the concept.
I think it's so highly unusual that this was women, that this level of violence was meted out by two women in a joint enterprise, with both having no restraint whatsoever and absolutely knowing they were there in this kind of sisterhood pact. Absolutely terrifying.
Charlotte and Linda Mulhall killed unconscious Farah Swali Noor before dismembering his body and disposing of the parts around Dublin. They showed no remorse, even stopping for breakfast with Farah's decapitated head with them in a bag. For their barbaric acts, Charlotte and Linda Mulhall will forever be known as two of the world's most evil killers.